So I will assume that you can, unless someone messages me that that's not the case. But great to be with you. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Turkey. Good morning, good evening to those of you who might be elsewhere in the world. It's wonderful to be with you. I hope you've had an exciting start to your day. And I'm really excited to be here to help contribute to this debate around regenerative businesses, how you can be leaders in this space, and some of the shifts that you need to be thinking about as we shift from kind of old ways of doing things to more regenerative, more sustainable ways of doing things. So firstly, who am I? So I'm Hannah Pathak. I'm the International Managing Director at Forum for the Future. And I've worked in climate change one way and another for around 20 years now. And that has spanned field research, trying to understand carbon cycling in forest ecosystems, through to humanitarian response. So the really sharp end of climate impacts and seeing that in some of the most vulnerable countries around the world. Then through to nearly 5 years now at Forum for the Future, where I provide strategic advisory and consultancy and advice to large companies around the world. So really thinking about it at the strategic end. So I feel very lucky because I've spanned the very tactical, really seeing the sharp end of climate change, through to the very strategic, to the work that I do at the moment. So I'm going to be sharing some of our thoughts from Forum for the Future about some of the approaches that we believe are critical for some of the shifts that need to be made for regenerative businesses. So for those of you not familiar with Forum, we're a non-profit organisation. We've been around for about 25 years. There's about 80 of us worldwide. We have offices in the US, in the UK, in India and in Singapore. And we're really focused on kind of key global challenges, particularly focusing on food, energy system and the purpose of business, which is why I'm here today to speak with you. And we work using systems change processes, so really trying to understand problems and their complexity, but also using futures, so trying to understand what might be happening 10 years, 20 years hence. And it's some of these elements that I'm going to be sharing with you today, some of these futures dimensions. So just last week, we launched our Future of Sustainability report. This is something that we launch annually, and this one is called The Courage to Transform. And I'll talk a bit more about courage and what this really means and kind of what underpins this. It's a report particularly for businesses, and it's really thinking about how businesses can and should respond to the complex challenges that are around us, and thinking about how you can build the kind of operational resilience and really trying to understand your role in tackling some of these social and environmental crises that we see all around us. And we use some futures tools to do this. So I really encourage you to go and take a look on the Forum for the Future website and have a look at the Future Sustainability report that's there. Just want to thank our partners, without whom this would absolutely not be possible at all. So incredibly appreciative for the generosity that makes that possible. It's a big endeavour to pull together a report like this, and we are lucky enough to have some long-standing, very supportive partners who assist us with this. So let's just take a moment. We're on a Wednesday in September, but let's just take a moment to position us in the here and now, and thinking about the year that we are in, but also the years that have been preceding, and some of the dialogue around the time that we're in. So there's a lot of talk about a polycrisis, there's climate change, the social inequality, there is conflict around the world, our supply chains are disrupted. There's a sense that change is happening faster and faster these days, and that actually this kind of time of polycrisis is probably our new normal. This is probably what is ahead of us in our personal lives and in our working lives. So how do we adapt to that? And that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. Just to sort of couch this in some facts and figures. So the July just passed saw 22 of the hottest days ever recorded. So the majority of the month was record days of heat and temperature. And doubtless many of you have experienced this firsthand, wherever you are in the world. Undoubtedly, you have experienced this. And if it's not heat, then it might be wildfires, it might be floods, it might be other kinds of natural disasters and weather events. And just to, again, sort of put in this futures dimension, for those who are born in 2020, they are more likely by these order of magnitudes to experience these kinds of disasters than someone born in 1960. So 8 times more heat waves, 4 times more droughts, 3 times more crop failures, and 3 times more river floods. So that's the shift that's happened in this time period. So in the 60-year time period, these are the shifts. Future generations and those being born now. So that's quite a stark realization. And there are a number of futures that lie ahead of us, and they really depend on the actions that we take in the present. So it is very likely, pretty much certain, that we will exceed 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels in the next few years, so before the end of this decade. At the moment, in spite of all of the net zero commitments made by companies and governments around the world, we're on track for somewhere between 2.7 and 3.4 degrees of warming by 2100. So by the end of this century, we're probably somewhere in that hothouse Earth dimension if we do not change our practices now. So that's quite scary and daunting. But the reality is, and the science does support this, is if we do change our actions now, we probably won't influence what's happening in 2030. There's degrees of warming that are locked in, but we probably can influence over this century. So the actions that we take now are critical because every fraction of a degree really matters. So the difference between 1.54 and 1.57 degrees, for example, makes a difference. So this is the kind of thing that we need to be thinking of. Now, when we hear these facts, it can feel quite daunting. And unfortunately, that can make us close in. It can make us sort of adopt this fearful position, like it's all too big, it's too much to do. But in fact, there is an immense amount that is already happening. There's huge momentum happening in terms of change. And I suspect you're all here because you are already part of this or want to be part of this. So we're going to be thinking about what that means in terms of actions that are taken. So if we just kind of, again, pause and think we're at a crossroads. The UN called this decade the decade of action because it's critical that we take actions now to secure a more stable climate. So we're at this kind of crossroads. We continue on with perhaps how we have been running our economic and our political and our social systems over the last 100 years or so, or we make changes. And there are a lot of signals that are indicating that there's very significant change happening. And again, this is the opportunity to be part of that, is to be engaging in these kinds of debates. But before we think about what that change looks like, one of the things we spend a lot of time at Forum thinking about is mindsets. So in case that term isn't familiar to you, what a mindset is your belief, your paradigm, it's your thinking about how the world works. And the reason why this is important is because it is mindsets that have created the world that we have around us. Every single thing, my pen, my phone, these are all products of human mind. We have created these things. So if we're going to create something different, so if we're going to create different kinds of brands that are structured differently, if we're going to create different ways of measuring success than GDP, for example, we need different mindsets to underpin those changes. So I'm going to be talking about kind of what that might look like in play, and I'm going to be sharing some case studies of businesses that are doing some inspiring work, and so give that sense of the how, the art of the possible. So hopefully leave you thinking, I can see how that perhaps could relate to my business, my organization. So I mentioned the Future of Sustainability report, and I mentioned that we use futures, which is a particular sort of practice. So in that report, we talk about 4 different trajectories, and each of these trajectories has a mindset behind it. And what they are potential pathways for the future. And we've taken them on a sort of 10-year time horizon. And we explore the character of those different possible, plausible futures. And each one has a mindset that underpins it, and each one would take the world in quite a different direction. Now, the reality is, in 2033, probably all 4 of these trajectories will still be visible. They'll all still be in play, but there might be one that is prevailing. And this is what we want to talk about, is how do you push for a prevailing trajectory that actually tackles global, social, and environmental challenges. And what we do is we look at signals in the here and now, so in the present, to identify the sort of different pathways that are in play at the moment. So I'll just quickly introduce you to the 4 trajectories, so that we have one that's called Profit Supreme, which, as you can guess from the name, is really focusing in on profit is king. We're not really focused on just transitions. We're really just focusing on maximizing opportunities that businesses can make. Then we have shallow gestures, where you could kind of call this maybe sort of a greenwashing model, where there is action, but it is not deep enough to really tackle the problems. It's not commensurate with the size and scale of the challenges. Then we have tech optimism, which is one where it's really kind of built on a mindset or an assumption that technology can save us, that innovation alone will be sufficient. Now, innovation is going to be incredibly important, but if we don't shift our human minds, then tech innovations by themselves are unlikely to be sufficient. And then finally, we have courage to transform, which is really about shifting mindsets and then shifting the ways of thinking, acting, and doing that align with that. And at Forum, we believe that it's really only this one that has the true transformative potential. So just in case the word courage perhaps is not terribly familiar to you, what we wanted to do is to kind of share a little bit about the root of where this word comes from. So it actually comes from the Latin root for the word for heart. And I think there's something really powerful in this. We live in this beautiful, bountiful world around us, and we've sort of lost connection with that. The fact that we are reliant on this planet for everything, for healthy, fulfilling lives. So there's something about connecting to the heart and kind of connecting to a sense of what we love and what we're passionate about that feels critical in this moment of kind of trying to think and act differently. So courage, just hold that in your mind, is linking to this kind of sense of heart and the seat of the emotions. And just wanted to pause here with a great quote. So I'll read it out just in case it's not super clear on your screens. But it's a quote from an American architect. And it says, "We are called to be architects of the future, not its victims." So this is a reminder of our individual and our collective agency to shape change. The future doesn't just happen to us. It is shaped intentionally or otherwise by a series of choices. So if we are making intentional choices, we can shape that direction. We can go more in that courage to transform direction if we're intentional about taking us in that direction. So just wanted to share this with you because, of course, like we all do plans, it's all neat, it's on a chart, it's in a spreadsheet, and this is this kind of linear A to B. We do one thing and it leads to another outcome. And then you look into the world around you and it's not how things play out. Things are messy and chaotic and interconnecting in reality. So actually kind of holding that reality is also really important in the current moment. So the climate crisis is also a health crisis. It is also an inequality crisis. It's also a nature crisis. So this sense of interconnectivity is absolutely critical. And the reason I mentioned that is because actually in your organizations thinking about where to act, you need to be thinking about these points of highest leverage. And usually that is where things intersect. So if you're thinking about climate change and you're thinking about decarbonisation, how can you think about social inequality or health inequality at the same time? If you're thinking about biodiversity, perhaps you're reliant on kind of agricultural commodities, for example, thinking about livelihoods at the same time, thinking about carbon storage potential of the soil at the same time. So this is what's critical, is this ability to see interconnections in the world, and then deciding where to act is based on those highest leverage points, which is at these points of intersection. And the word emergency, I think, gets used more and more in our news, whether that's for a specific event or whether that's for kind of the climate emergency around us at a sort of much more globalized level. But kind of just again, sort of going back to words and the words we use and how they matter, is inside the word emergency is emerge. And from emergencies, new things do come forth. And this is a lovely quote from a wonderful writer and activist, Rebecca Solnit, but that the old certainties are crumbling fast, but danger and possibility are sisters. So again, holding this, that we are in times of emergency, but actually that creates potential for change emerging from that. And I just want to share a number of kind of 5 principles, 5 mindset shifts. And I'm going to share an example in each case of how a business has acted using this shifted mindset to kind of ground it in what is possible, the art of the possible. So kind of old ways of thinking from a risk mitigation mindset. So people kind of thinking we do enough to kind of stop the risk occurring, and we don't do more than that. Whereas actually in a transformative mindset, it is thinking, well, people made the rules, we have made the rules, so we know we can change them. If they're not fit for purpose anymore, we think about transforming them. And as an example of this is Dong Energy, which became Ørsted. So you perhaps might be familiar with this story, but Dong Energy had one of Europe's biggest its assets were all in coal-powered fuel stations. But there was a point at which they read the writing on the wall that actually fossil fuel era was going to be coming to an end. And so they decided to transform. So they took the huge leap, the huge risky leap of kind of curtailing their coal-related assets and instead becoming Ørsted and instead becoming one of Europe's largest wind power providers. And that's a huge leap to leave behind the old and leap into something new. But that has served them incredibly well because they saw what the future was holding and they made that transformation ahead of time, ahead of being forced to, for example. And actually, this is really playing out in their profits. So their profits are excellent and they are really positioning themselves as a leader in the renewable space through that transformation that they've made. Another example is kind of shifting from looking at the symptoms of a crisis, where it's sort of like looking at symptoms of an illness, for example, and trying to find that one silver bullet that will fix it, but instead shifting to thinking about the root causes of the crisis. And this is where that kind of interconnected nature is critical. So knowing that the issues we face are complex, so we want to focus on tackling their root causes. So an example here is with Coca-Cola, which started to think about water, critical to their products, was thinking about it just in terms of water volume. But the shift they've made is understanding water in its context, that it is in a watershed, in a water basin, in an ecosystem. People are reliant on that water for their livelihoods. And that's the shift that they have made. So they're now looking at this whole watershed level and thinking about the interconnected nature of the water that they use and need, and how else that water plays out in the environment, whether that's people, planet, habitats, and so on. That's a big shift in thinking about kind of the underlying relationships between things. Then shifting from a kind of passive approach, we're in the rules of the game here, we just act within it, for example, versus to shifting to thinking we can shape our operating context, particularly collectively. And this might be something that you might be able to connect through the course of this event, other leaders in this space. How can you come together to shift your operating context? How can you come together to call for different regulation? How can you come together to push your politicians, to push other business leaders to act in a way that's more aligned with regenerative outcomes? So 3 quick examples here. So Nestle doing a huge amount kind of business to business, kind of calling for regenerative agriculture, to others who are also involved in regenerative agriculture, but also really influencing their employees around the importance of regenerative agriculture. They've made some really strong commitments around regenerative agriculture by 2030. Then we have a really interesting example of 3 organizations coming together, including PepsiCo, to create this kind of supplier framework, which is helping others adopt measures to become more sustainable. And this is exciting because it's an example of 3 potential competitors actually coming together to create a platform that's for the greater good to help others accelerate in their transitions. And then lastly, the example here is around Diageo, also focusing heavily on regenerative agriculture and using their consumer-facing approach to influence and educate their consumers about this importance as well. Another principle, which is shifting from kind of centralized decision-making through to more agile, more distributed governance models, more anticipatory. So this is acknowledging that the pace of change is happening very fast, and old style ways of thinking and planning and leading are not really suitable for a highly complex, highly volatile world. So a fantastic example here is IKEA, where they've shifted from annual planning cycles to scenario-based planning cycles, acknowledging the dynamic shifts that are happening around them, shifts in supply chains. We had the Panama Canal crisis just a couple of weeks ago. That affects many, many companies. But if it's not in your annual planning, you're not going to be ready. Whereas if you start to anticipate these and have sort of scenarios around which you plan, you're going to be much more resilient. And then thinking about biases, again, it's quite similar to mindset. So there's often an assumption that we might be exempt from bias. We'll just do what everyone else is doing. It will all work out. But actually, it's about understanding your biases and incorporating them into decision making, bringing them to the surface. So stop making them unconscious, make them conscious, and then challenge them. And there's a number of kind of biases that affect our decision making. So things like optimism bias, it will all work out fine, or trade off bias, it will be too expensive to change it, or recency bias, it will just be like what we've just experienced. So it's just bringing these to the surface and challenging them, and then you'll make better decisions as a result. So just wanted to recap these. And they are in the report, so I really encourage you to kind of go and take a look at that. But so it's shifting the mindsets to a transformational mindset, looking at root causes, thinking about how you can shape your operating context around you. So new rules of the game for all, effectively. Thinking about anticipatory governance and anticipatory leadership, and then bringing to the surface these biases that we have and often don't realize we have, and starting to challenge them and work beyond those. So just to reconnect you all back. So back to this word courage, back to the word heart, back to thinking about what we're passionate about and how we can work together collectively using this kind of this heart, this passion, our emotions to make some of the shifts that we want to make. So thank you so much for listening. If you want to scan that, you can takes you directly to the report. So do go for that. We'd love to work with businesses who are kind of wanting to push the edge of the change. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, please do so. And you can connect with me there, and then I can put you in touch with wider people in the team if it's not me that you need to speak to. But I just really wanted to share kind of the final sort of thought is that this is something I'm incredibly passionate about. I really do believe that kind of collective action is what can shift the future that lies ahead of us. And like all big and scary adventures, they're often better done with others who are also on that same journey. So as you go through the rest of your session today and tomorrow and beyond, just kind of think about how you can connect to that and connect to others who are sharing that passion as well. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of event.